On the first episode of Running the Business, I thought I would explain a little bit why I've included the word running in there and why that's so important to me. My business background has been in growing a running event business and lots of other businesses attached to it. But for me, I thought I'd include why running and why running is relevant to business itself. And I think that there's so many parallels between those two things. The way that running and the way that you train for elite running mirrors business at a high level in a really clear and obvious way. And I want to kind of go through a bit of my running background and how I got to the point I'm at, and then a little bit about how those two things interlink and why I want to start this podcast and why I want to try and talk to business leaders in sport. I want to talk to people who are leading brands, who are leading different projects within the sporting space and in business. And I think from my background itself, I worked my way through the rankings in the junior system in the running world, and I won national titles at junior age groups. I performed and loved the sport from such a young age. My family was engrossed in it from I was a child. But when I got myself into the later stages of my running career and I went to university, I went to Loughborough University, which is the world's biggest sporting university. And there I actually learned how elite athletes operate, how the environment operates, how the performance of how running is done at elite level is planned. It is a lot more behind the scenes for that elite level, elite track and field than you could probably imagine. And for me, seeing those coaches, seeing those athletes putting their sessions together and planning their year out was a real big motivating factor for me to think about how we grow and scale a business. And I work with some amazing people, but a lot of them were focused on running, and that was what their sphere. So in order for me to develop and learn the things that I did, I had to do a lot of learning. But I want to talk about in business learning as well, practically failing, doing things right, doing things wrong, but then also actually implementing the stuff that I've actually learned as well. So for me, I want to talk about here a bit about some of the things that athletes, I think, do that business people also need to do as well. And one of those things is long-term thinking. And no athlete really thinks in just one-off race. They're thinking about, obviously, the Olympic finals, how they do things, but they have to think in cycles. They have to think about the whole system of what they're doing. It can't just be about the now. They're sacrificing today for a future benefit. And I think that's got a lot of parallels with business as well. If you do one thing, you start one project, you don't expect that to actually come to fruition very quickly. You're expecting it to be a long haul before it actually starts making some progress and some sort of meaningful impact. Also, the consistency and the intensity of things when you're training in athletics. So the best athletes aren't doing a session or a really fast run every single day or a race every single day. They're doing the boring things on repeat on a daily basis, which is very parallel to running, to business as well, where you've got tasks that you're doing that you don't necessarily enjoy, tasks that you're doing that aren't necessarily the best thing that you could think about doing that day, but you need to do them in order to build the foundations to be able to get to the next stage. So you're building systems in business, like in the same way that you're doing your reps and your sessions over a long period of time. And that's a really important factor I think you need to take into account when you're comparing those two different things, which is elite level sport, running, and also the business world as well. And another thing you can think about is also trusting in the process of things. And when you're an athlete, you often have a coach that gives you the information, and then you go and execute on that. And you're trusting that coach has the right information to give you that you can then develop yourself. And it's the same thing in business as well. You come to a business, there'll be a system or a process involved that you'll have to follow. And if you follow that process, you'll do the job well, you'll perform at a good level. But sometimes it's that extra little bit on top of things where you do the extra reading, the extra learning, the extra reps to make sure that you can become the person you want to become and progress in your career as well. So you also learn from the things you do wrong in running. So if you have a bad race with bad tactics, and you don't perform as well as you wanted to, or you get an injury from doing too much training or too much under training in a certain area, it's the same thing in business. Like the things you do wrong, the meetings you miss, the things you say that aren't quite correct, that don't actually follow through, that's how you learn what to do and what not to do. And I think that's a really important part of business, running, elite level sport that I've learned over the years anyway. And for me itself, like I progressed from the elite level side of things and I kind of went into a more of a recreational runner, a bit more of a lifestyle thing rather than it being my full identity, which is a very hard thing to deal with. I was I was Matt the runner. This is who I was. I had no other real identity apart from that. And for me to then change that and to try and develop myself was interesting. And I think that in business as well, once you get to a certain level or a certain skill set, you have to push yourself. You have to reinvent yourself sometimes to get to the next stage of things. And I think that running replicates that as well. If you perform at a certain level this 1 year and you run a certain time, or you compete and you win a certain event, next year those people who you're competing against will be doing training to try and beat you the next year. So you've got to try and up your skill set, up your level. And the same thing for times and improving yourself. There's always something you can do. There's always a second or an inch you can improve on while you're running. And watching those elite athletes do that and watching how they do that and how they prepare for that, I think has been a good foundational thing for me to think about when moving forward. And also the identity part of what I talked about then. I personally find it very hard to detach from Matt the runner. And I think even now I'm finding it very hard to detach from Matt, the business person who loves running. So it's that same mentality of going all in on something, I think does well in the business space as well. You have to be all in. You have to really care about the thing you're working on. There's no reason to do something that you don't enjoy on a day-to-day basis. And I think to do the best you can, you have to really, really love it. And especially when you're building a business, you have to have non-stop, relentless pursuit of the goal. And if you don't have that, it means you don't love it enough. And I think that's the same thing when you're doing your running. Like, people treat it as a job. You have to be systemized. You have to be clever with how you do things. But recovery and the way you train and the progressive overload, that's all part of the process and part of loving what you do. Not doing any of those things wouldn't be very good for your performance. So you would always do those things. I think also building in cycles and how athletics and elite running is done, you're thinking of your peaks, thinking of your training peaks, you're improving yourself over chunks of time. So it's the same thing in business. You're working quarter to quarter, for example, or year to year to see if your performance of the business improves or goes down or remains static. And it's important that you're planning in different periods of time where it might be a renewal cycle within your training, like a down cycle within your training for running, for example. When you finish the season, you finish your big key races, you might take a couple of weeks off where you're doing absolutely nothing and build back up again. It's the same thing in business. You have to have those cycles personally to be able to stay motivated and on the ball. Like, I'm probably not a great example of, because I'm always on with what I'm doing, but I think it is said that in business you need to have time away from the thing you're doing in order to like learn more about yourself and the way you think of things to be able to apply things moving forward. And I do think that, like in elite athletics and in business, the environment you're working in matters. So the people you work with day to day, the people you talk to, the people you take advice from, that all matters. And the people you are working with in a business environment is your culture. And the culture in a training group is probably often the same thing. Like, if everyone in your training group isn't doing the extra mile or the extra rep or the extra nutrition that they need to do to stay dialed in, if they're going out and doing social things rather than staying at home and resting, like, that's not conducive to an elite athlete environment. It's the same thing in business. If you're not around people who are motivated, who are pushing forward, who are learning, who are wanting to improve the business itself, but also themselves, you'll find yourself in a cycle that isn't the best and the most conducive to improving the business you're working on and yourself. And who you're listening to, coaches, advisors, I think from my perspective, I've read a lot of books. I've read a lot of business books. And I think that for me has been my mentor, I suppose. Multiple people who wrote multiple books, doing that extracurricular work to make sure I was refining my craft is something that I was really passionate about from when I finished my running career to do this. And I think in the running world as well, like, you have to be really you have to really focus on who your coach is and who you trust, because if you don't have the right coach or you don't believe in what your coach is saying, you're never really going to actually perform to the level you want to do. So it's important. And for me, the feedback loop as well from that. So once you're doing your training and you have a good coach, you're going to get information from that coach to be able to improve the next stage. And if you're not getting that feedback, you're not going to improve. So selecting the right coach is important. And in business as well, you often get feedback from the tasks you do, that tasks that work, the tasks that don't work. And keeping that in the mind when you're growing your business is really important, I think. And I think for RunThrough, which is the running business that we built. So we've combined the business side of my life into the running side of my life, and working with my business partner, Ben, the co-founder of RunThrough. Like, we didn't try and build the one-off biggest event in the world. We tried to build a company that had the most events. And in order to do that, you had to think about it in a similar way to how you're building endurance. And Ben was an elite athlete as well himself, so he knows this stuff. And you need to have progressive overload. You need to be able to grow a business sustainably and effectively. You need to make sure you're not just doing too much too soon, because you will run out of money, and you will run out of rope, essentially, to grow that business. And we built it organically over a long period of time by putting the effort in and the care and attention into this business, which we love more than life itself. We want to make sure that that is growing and growing and growing over the next 10 years. And the same way you do with your training, you need to make sure you're doing bits every single year. If you're doing a altitude camp and you're going away for 2 or 3 weeks, and you jump in with extreme training that's completely different to what you've done at home, you're going to get injured. And you can't get injured when you're running a business. It has to continue. And when I say injured for business, would be like cash flow issues or overtrading. Like, you can't do that unless you've got big VC backing with money from other people to be able to spend. And that's the intention, to grow quickly. What we did at RunThrough was organic. It was safe. It was there was risk involved in terms of what we were doing, but at this point in time, with the world's biggest running event company, it shows that you can, over a long period of time, build yourself into something that is extraordinary. And I think that systems and slow and consistent growth over a long period of time is an effective way to grow a sustainable business. Like, RunThrough hasn't been slow, but it's compared to the other competitors in the industry, but it has been something that's been very sustainable. And I think that's very relatable to someone who's starting out in a sport and elite athletics, for example. Most elite athletes come from a childhood of running a certain level, improving and doing more mileage, more training, more sessions, to get to the point when they're in their 20s, where they're actually performing and doing really high intense training that people will look at and go, wow, this person trains so much. They're so fit and healthy, and they've done all this so quick. And all that's come from years and years and years of training and progressive overload. They didn't go into that 150 mile a week, 120 mile a week, two sessions a day. They didn't do that straight away. They built up to that. And the same thing for a sustainable business, has to do those things, unless you are VC backed or have some sort of investment to do that really quickly. And yeah, RunThrough grew like training does. It didn't grow in spikes, but it grew in layers over a long period of time. And I think, if you're willing to think long term, if you're willing to think in consistent, boring reps over a long period of time, I feel that that's the way you should run a business, like a business like RunThrough. There's other businesses that you want to come into and do it quickly and do it fast with big pockets, then that's a completely different model to what RunThrough was. So on this podcast, I'm going to be talking to people who have different views, different experiences, different lived experiences, who are running different businesses that we can talk to, learn from, and I can find interesting conversations to be able to help build RunThrough and build our collective group of events at GW Active and Top Flight. So really excited to get this podcast going. Looking forward to speak to all these people we're going to talk to. And for me, this first episode was me just explaining a little bit about my running background, a little bit about what I want to do on this podcast and who I want to talk to. And I think that if you could stick with me over the next couple of years, you're going to have some interesting conversations and hear some interesting conversations and learn from some really cool people. But yeah, that's me for today. That's the end of the first episode, and we'll speak soon.